The waters are very muddy, and as they weave their way slowly past the city of Babylon, for in ancient Mesopotamia there was really no wood and no brick to build. Everything was built out of mud, for the river provided plenty of that. They sun-baked it if they were not counting on it to last for more than 200 or 300 years, and they baked it in hard ovens, became hard as a rock if they were counting on things to last much longer. Each year, once a year, the gods were brought out from their temple where they were enshrined. And in a gala festival, the priests would march along the streets, carrying on their shoulders the gods and chanting and shouting. And the people of the city were required by the government and their religion to stand alongside of the road and to sing praises unto the gods of Babylon. They would reach the river. There would be boats waiting to carry them across, and the procession continued on the other side until it reached the temple itself, and there the gods were enthroned for yet another year. Clap your hands, all people, shout to God with loud songs of joy, for the Lord the Most High is terrible, a great king over the earth. He subdued peoples under us and nations under our feet. He chose our heritage for us, the pride of Jacob, whom he loves. God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of a trumpet. Sing praises to God, sing praises. Sing praises to our King, sing praises. For God is the King of all the earth, and praises with a song. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. The princes of the people gather as the people of God of Abraham. For the shields of the earth belong to God, and he is highly exalted. It is not certain that in ancient Israel God was enthroned on the New Year's Day festival. Many of the scholars who hold that he was claim that the Psalm 47, which we just read, is one of the Psalms of enthronement. The reason I begin with this as we try to understand the church in the 1980s is to recognize that we are dealing in 1980 with precisely one of the problems which has been from the very beginning of time in terms of religion. The crisis that is going to be continuing and highlighted in ever special ways in the 80s is the crisis which is going to be highlighted throughout history as we seek to understand the relationship of the people of God to the organized religion that goes in the name of God. In ancient Babylon, as we've often talked about, we recognize that the people themselves had no responsibility for religion except on that one festival a year to line the streets along the road and to shout out to the gods as they came along, Marduk, the chief god of one period of Babylon, and to pay their dues to the temples. There was no such thing as being pushed for the ordinary man about personal morality, and nobody was really too concerned about how he lived his own life as long as he did not live it in a way that endangered the state or the religious enterprise. It was the king and the princes and the nobility that had concern about religion, and it was the priests who catered to those individuals. The rites were specifically rites which would deal with not only emphasizing the need for the nobles to understand God in their lives, not from a moral force, but from a predictive force. As a means of letting people know what the future was going to be. And hundreds of thousands of tablets have been found and inscribed where there were all kinds of ritual slaughters. And they would deal with the liver and study it before and after events to see if there was some way in which they could predict for the nobility whether or not they would win a war or lose it, whether or not it would be a good crop or a poor, whether or not they ought to take a wife or not, whether or not the child was going to be born healthy. And at the same time to inspire the kind of fear in the nobility that caused them to respect the priestly control. Then came the prophets of Israel. And for the first time, religion was moved out of the ranks of the priestly class and began to be talked about not only in terms of the people who were in positions of power, but the average man in the street. Religion was no longer that which was used only in certain rarefied circles. Indeed, religion became not a tool of prediction for the future, but a tool of chastisement for the present. Amos could go from Tekoa to Samaria. He could make fun of and point the finger very directly at the kings and the people of Samaria and what they were doing in terms of their own existence, but he did it not only in terms of the wealthy, but of the poor. Religion became more and more, in the biblical dimension, a religion of the human spirit. And by the time we come to the New Testament, we are finding that Jesus is spending the vast majority of his time talking to the common man. Not as a tool of the powerful, but as a reflection of the beginning of God in life. Conflict is an interesting conflict because it continues to this very day. You're well aware by now that I'm still plowing on through Chesapeake, and one of the powers of Chesapeake is the struggle between the Quakers and the rest of the people in the Chesapeake Bay area and in Maryland, which was never quite sure whether it was north or south, on the question of slavery. And preachers were hired who could preach a good sermon on slavery. And here were black slaves who were brought to this country against their will, lined up to listen to sermons about how good God was to them and how much better God would be if they would obey their masters. And they could pull out of the scriptures and out of context and out of a whole host of things and make slaves believe that that was the godly will. And black preachers began to read and study the Bible for themselves and were threatened with death because one ought not to read the Bible. It ought to be interpreted for you. And as the black preachers began to read, they found that the Bible was not a book about master-slave. It was a book of freedom. Freedom from any earthly masters because one became in tune with the godly master. Freedom from the boundaries of our own existence so that we could expand and open up and understand. Freedom from those things which have forced so many of us into molds, to break the mold so that Paul could shout out, "Do not let the world press you into its mold, but find the liberating spirit that comes from God." What a power to begin to break the things that have happened, to let each individual stand before God, as the Protestant Revolution has said, and to try to understand God in his life individually. What a dangerous doctrine. You can understand why the great preachers of history have always been looked upon as dangerous individuals, radicals, people for whom mass society has had little use. We are a society, even to this great day, in our great country, which likes to squeeze people into a mold and hold them there. An uppity nigger was an individual who didn't know his place. And a good nigger was an individual who knew his place and bowed and shuffled and tipped his hat to men and took it off to women and stepped off into the gutter no matter what the gutter was like to let white folk go by. He knew his place. He a good nigger. One heard throughout the Chesapeake area and throughout much of the South. And then comes the liberating Spirit of God that says you are good. But you are good not because you're shuffling and not be good because you are uneducated and held down. You are good because you are a child of God. And the liberating spirit of the church began to move in the black community. People found freedom. And it ran into the face of the kind of tyranny which has always tried to hold people down for its own purposes. For religion is one of the tools of all tyranny. The Spirit moved and people stood. and were counted. And freedom came. And then we went through a period. And the churches reorganized, and the churches which had proclaimed the freedom became more and more of an organization and less of the movement of God within its membership. They began to say, wouldn't it be nice, as the ancient Israelites had done as well, if we had leaders that could tell us what's the best way to do. They began to play games with themselves, and it's an interesting game, and it's one that we all do. Obviously, if somebody has studied, they're more specialized in this area than we are. Maybe they have the power to tell us and to help us to know more and more about the religious dimension. And once again, the prophetic spirit begins to be squelched, and the power of an organized church and religion begins to move in. And people turn away from their own God to a masterful leading spirit. And we began this year with the massacre of innocents in Guyana, where men and women and children and families were put to death by allowing themselves to be put under the spirit of a Reverend Jim Jones. But it's not just the Reverend Jim Jones and the whole concept of the cults and so on that's calling it into place. It's much of mainstream Protestantism. As the Catholic Church has moved more and more towards an understanding of freedom, struggling mightily within itself, the Protestant Church has moved more and more towards an outer concept of successfulness. I hope, I'm not going to try to answer what success is for a church like Pine Hill, but I hope in the days to come, and as you reflect with the committee, that you will try to know what success is. Success becomes ever more an external factor. The number of people sitting in the pew, the size of the building, the size of the budget, the growing factors, the number of people that can talk about what a wonderful minister they have, whether or not they remember a thing that has been said from the pulpit. Success becomes more and more a feeling good. Nobody challenges you to find within your own life the answers, but answers are provided and you're told they're okay and you're doing fine. Success becomes more and more in many of the churches where you are told what God can do for you and you're never asked what God requires of you. I don't know how many of you have followed the recommendation of the winners, the gospel for the person who has everything. I skimmed it the first time, and I've been reading it more seriously. I'm going to recommend that if any of you want to pay $3.50 plus tax for this book, that you see Don Winter, and I'm volunteering Don to buy copies of the book for you. He recommended it. He should, right? He knows where he got it. You ought to study this book carefully. You ought to read every page and every word and study it. It's a simple book. It is not profound except in its simplicity. But it hits to the core of the various religious movements that are sweeping the country. You hear me at times speak from the pulpit and say that's one man's opinion and all that, but I'd like to pick up one on that. What bothers me is that the church, far from helping people grow up, too often babies people and perpetuates their childishness. For instance, the pastor is often depicted as the parent who presides over a conglomeration of children. In many congregations, the pastor becomes the father-mother figure for the church. The pastor becomes the advice giver, confessor, arbitrator, disciplinarian, and benevolent autocrat of the communion table. And most people love it. Dr. Robert Schuller of the Hour of Power TV fame urges ministers to become unashamed dictators of their congregations. Schuller guarantees that this clerical paternalism will produce larger congregations. There are probably enough grown-up children who are looking not for Christ, but for mommies and daddies to make Schuller's approach successful. It can be reassuring to think that there is someone on a black robe and clerical collar who can tell us what to do, what to think, and how to act. It may be reassuring. Whether it is realistic or Christian is another matter. But it's not only the Robert Schulers. We have seen a woman who has made a stand for ERA, rejected from her church because it goes against official church doctrine. We have seen a priest, a theologian of note, a historian who was in trouble with his church because Hans Kuhn has made stands which have been unpopular and at the same time run into conflict with his church. It is a time when the spirit of freedom and where individuals are asked to reflect upon their own existence is going to run head on into the kind of religious experience that says you will do what I say, not what God says. I have the power to be a dictator. I can guarantee if you will turn your lives over to me, we will double our membership in a year. I wouldn't do it for anything in the world. You know what I would do the first thing as a dictator in this church? I would set up appointments for each one of you to come in with your financial reserves and tell you how much you're going to pledge. I also would assign you various duties and functions that you're going to fulfill in the church for the coming year. I would send you out and I would sit there and radiate on about. And at the end of the year, you would look and say, look how much our giving has improved and look at the number of people are here. Isn't Jim Lyons wonderful? And I would say, we have numbers, we have money, we have growth, we have a building program, we have a youth program, but we have not God. For the power of the gospel is not, is Jim Lyons wonderful, but is not God. The power of my life. And as Chris has worked with the young people, and as I've been working with the young people over the few years, I'm always amazed at how many young people do things not because it's right for them to do, but because it will please mommy and daddy. And the greatest challenge that parents face is to liberate themselves from the position of being a power figure to allow the developing spirit of a child to become whole in itself, making decisions that are right for the child to make on the basis of its right to do, not that it will please mommy or daddy. The church in the 80s is facing that kind of a question. Pine Hill is facing that kind of a question because it's not that different from other churches in this respect. I think that more and more and more as the pressures build on the churches in many areas to provide benevolent dictators, it is precisely the role of a church like Pine Hill to stand up and say, hell no, we won't go. The trend that steals our personality, that steals our individuality, that steals our right to make even the wrong decisions. Or it is as the church stands and radiates out and makes mistakes and grows and develops, and each individual sitting here finds something in his own life to challenge his life and to face himself even more adequately. The church is doing the work of God. And I'd rather have 5 people who know God in their lives than 5,000 who are looking only to the external. Where will the church go? I have no idea, totally. The church as a whole will ultimately depend upon its own people. Some will choose daddies and mommies that will lead them. Others will choose to be free and to challenge all authority. Neither one is right. What is right is the acknowledgement that the reign of God has come and God is available to each and every one of us to transform our lives into a dynamic, living whole.